The fog over the East River didn't just drift, it swallowed. On the night of August 29th, 1776, 9,000 men stood on the edge of a watery grave in Brooklyn, listening to the rhythmic, wet thud of British boots drawing closer. They could smell the salt air mixed with the copper tang of blood and the sulfur of spent muskets. These weren't soldiers yet. They were tailors, farmers, and boys who had never seen a man's chest cavity opened by a bayonet. Now they were trapped. Behind them was a deep, unforgiving river. In front of them was the most powerful empire on earth, sharpened and ready to finish the rebellion in a single bloody stroke. George Washington sat atop his horse in the gloom, a man watching his entire legacy and the throat of a new nation being fitted for the noose. The silence was the worst part. It was the silence of a trap snapping shut. The disaster had begun days earlier under a blistering summer sun. The Continental Army had been outmaneuvered, outclassed, and utterly broken at the Battle of Long Island. They had watched their comrades be driven into the marshes by Hessian mercenaries who gave no quarter, pinning men into the mud with steel until the tide rose to drown the survivors. Now, huddled in the dirtworks of Brooklyn Heights, the American Revolution was a dying fire. The men were shivering despite the humidity, their hands shaking as they gripped rusted firelocks. They looked at Washington, and for the first time, they didn't see a leader of myth. They saw a man who had led them into a cul-de-sac of death. The air was heavy with the realization that by sunrise they would either be in chains or cold in the ground. Washington knew the math. He had no ships. The Royal Navy sat like silent monsters in the harbor, waiting for the wind to shift so they could sail up the river and cut off the only exit. His officers whispered about surrender, their voices cracking. But Washington made a choice born of pure, desperate iron. He didn't call for a last stand. He called for the fog. He ordered every flat-bottomed boat, every fishing smack, and every rowboat from the city to be gathered in secret. He put the oars in the hands of Massachusetts fishermen, men who knew the water like their own pulse, and told them to move an army in the dark. The evacuation was a choreography of terror. Men were told to keep their mouths shut on pain of death. They wrapped their wagon wheels in rags to muffle the clatter against the stones. One by one, units were pulled from the front lines and marched toward the water, leaving a skeleton crew behind to keep the campfires burning. Those left in the trenches were the forlorn hope, men tasked with pretending an entire army was still there, knowing that if the British realized the ruse, they would be the first to die. Every time a horse whinnied or a canteen clinked against a rock, 1,000 hearts stopped. They were stealing their lives back from the British, one muffled oar stroke at a time. As the sun began to peak over the horizon, a cold sweat broke out among the officers. Thousands of men were still waiting on the shore, exposed and visible. Then a miracle of weather arrived, a providential fog so thick you couldn't see your own hand. It draped over the river like a funeral shroud, masking the final boats as they pushed off. Washington was the last man to step into the final boat. As the mist eventually burned away, the British surged into the American camp, bayonets fixed, expecting a massacre. They found nothing but cold ash and empty tents. The rebels were gone. They had vanished into the gray. The revolution survived that night, but the men who crossed the river were never the same. They had looked into the mouth of the empire and felt the breath of their own extinction. They escaped the noose in Brooklyn, but the war would drag on for 7 more years, paved with the frozen feet of Valley Forge and the rotting hulls of prison ships. We remember the victory, but we forget the smell of the mud and the way the water felt like ice against the skin of men who were certain they were ghosts before they even died. The United States was not born in a hall of signatures. It was dragged, shivering and terrified, across a black river in the dead of night, saved by a fog that shouldn't have been there. The fog didn't just hide the retreat, it masked a collapse of the soul. As the sun climbed over Manhattan, the men who collapsed onto the cobblestones of the city weren't cheering. They were hollowed out. They had survived, but they were a defeated force running from a ghost that was still gaining ground. Washington stood on the pier, his boots caked in Brooklyn mud, watching the mist dissolve to reveal the British masts still clogging the harbor. He had saved his men, but he had lost the soil. He had lost the harbor, and very soon he would lose the city.
The weeks that followed were a descent into a specific kind of American purgatory. New York City, a forest of timber and brick, became a tinderbox of paranoia. Spies moved through the shadows of taverns, and neighbors looked at one another with a new, sharp hunger, wondering who would be the first to sell a soul to the crown for a warm bed and a pardon. On September 21, the tension snapped. A fire ignited at the tip of the island, a small flame that the wind caught and turned into a screaming wall of heat. It tore through the city, turning churches into chimneys and homes into ash. Through the smoke, British soldiers hunted incendiaries, bayoneting anyone they suspected of starting the blaze. They threw men into the fires they were accused of lighting. In the middle of this burning wreckage walked Nathan Hale. He was 21, a schoolteacher with the soft hands of a scholar and the suicidal bravery of the young. Washington needed eyes inside the British camps, and Hale volunteered for a mission that was essentially a death sentence. He wasn't a professional. He was an amateur playing a game of life and death against a global superpower. When he was caught, there was no trial, no dignified exchange of prisoners. There was only a tree, a ladder, and a length of hemp rope. The British didn't want a martyr. They wanted a warning. They let Hale hang in the wind, a swinging pendulum of failed ambition. It was a message to every rebel hiding in the woods of New Jersey or the hills of New York. This is how your revolution ends. Not with the bang of a cannon, but with the snap of a neck in a dusty orchard. By December, the Continental Army was a trail of bloody footprints in the snow. The cause was a joke whispered in London salons. Men were deserting by the hundreds, their shoes rotting off their feet, their skin turning gray from typhus. The dream of 1776 was rotting in the fields. Washington was down to a few thousand ragamuffins, men who were no longer fighting for a flag, but for the man on the white horse who refused to quit. He was a general without a country, leading an army of shadows toward a frozen river in Pennsylvania called the Delaware. The world went quiet as the ice began to choke the water. The gamble was total. If the crossing at Trenton failed, if the Hessians woke up too soon, if the wind blew too hard, there would be no second fog to save them. There would be no more miracles. History would have remembered George Washington as a failed surveyor who led a generation of boys to their deaths for a tax dispute. The American experiment was a heartbeat away from flatlining in the freezing dark, held together only by the desperate rhythmic thud of oars hitting ice and the silent, terrifying knowledge that for these men there was nowhere left to run but straight into the mouth of the enemy. The Delaware River on Christmas night 1776 was not a scenic backdrop. It was a black artery of jagged ice and churning death. The temperature had plummeted, turning a cold rain into a blinding horizontal sleet that sliced at the exposed skin of men who hadn't eaten a hot meal in days. Washington's plan was a masterpiece of insanity. He was moving 2,400 men, heavy artillery, and skittish horses across a river choked with ice floes the size of small houses, all in the dead of a winter gale. The Durham boats, massive black hulls designed to haul iron ore, groaned under the weight. Each time a chunk of ice slammed into the wood, the men inside felt the vibration in their marrow, a reminder that the river was a hungry beast waiting for one slip, one panicked move to pull them under. Across the water in Trenton, the Hessians were not the drunken revelers of legend. They were professional killers, German mercenaries who had been bred for war since childhood. They were disciplined, terrifyingly efficient, and currently hunkered down against a storm they believed no human army would dare move in. Their commander, Colonel Johann Rahl, had contempt for the country clowns he was fighting. He had ignored repeated warnings of an American advance, stuffing a frantic note from a loyalist spy into his pocket without reading it. He chose the warmth of his quarters and the arrogance of his rank over the safety of his perimeter. It was a fatal mistake, born of the belief that the rebels were already broken. The crossing took hours longer than planned. The sun was already threatening to rise as the last man stepped onto the Jersey shore, shivering so violently his musket rattled. Washington stood in the snow, his watch in hand, realizing they had lost the cover of darkness. He had two choices: retreat and be caught on the riverbanks in bloody daylight, or march 9 miles through a blizzard and attack a rested, professional garrison with an army of frozen ghosts. He chose the march. Men fell out of line, their hearts simply stopping from the cold. 2 privates froze to death where they sat during a brief rest. The blood from the barefoot soldiers left a literal trail on the white road, a crimson map for anyone following behind.
When they hit Trenton at 8 in the morning, the violence was sudden and absolute. The American cannons, dragged through the slush, were wheeled into the streets. The roar of grape shot shattered the morning silence, turning the cobblestones into a killing floor. The Hessians spilled out of their barracks, half-dressed and reaching for their rifles, but they were met with a wall of desperate men who knew this was their last chance to exist. There was no room for maneuver, only the frantic, wet sound of bayonets finding home in the fog. Rahl fell from his horse, mortally wounded by a musket ball, the unread warning still crumpled in his pocket. The victory was total, but the cost was etched into the faces of the survivors. They had captured nearly 1,000 prisoners, but the real prize was the realization that the empire could bleed. Yet, as they marched their captives back toward the river, the adrenaline faded to reveal a haunting truth. They were still starving, they were still freezing, and the British Army was only miles away, waking up like a disturbed hornet's nest. They had won a battle, but they had invited the full, unbridled wrath of the Crown. The war wasn't over. It had merely become a personal vendetta. The American Revolution didn't end with a handshake that morning. It ended with 1,000 men staring at their bloodied hands in the snow, realizing that by choosing to live another day, they had condemned themselves to years of more slaughter. They had crossed the river, but in doing so, they had burned the bridge behind them. There was no going home to the farm anymore. There was only the long, dark road ahead, lit by the fires of cities they couldn't yet see, and the heavy, silent weight of the dead they had left behind in the ice. The victory at Trenton was a lightning strike in a bottle, but by New Year's Eve, the bottle was shattering. The Continental Army was literally evaporating. The enlistments for the majority of Washington's men expired at midnight on December 31st. These men were walking skeletons, their skin yellowed by jaundice, their feet wrapped in rotting rags, their minds haunted by the screams of the Jersey woods. They had done their part, they had won their miracle. Now they wanted to go home to their wives and their unplowed fields before the winter claimed what was left of them. Washington stood on a frozen field in Princeton, New Jersey, facing a line of men who were already turning their backs on the war. He rode his horse to the front, the wind whipping his cloak, and did something a general rarely does. He pleaded. He promised them a $10 bounty, money he didn't have, backed by a Congress that was currently fleeing for its life. He told them that the present period would determine their destiny. He wasn't talking about taxes or tea anymore. He was talking about the right to exist without a boot on their necks. He told them that if they left now, the fire they had lit at Trenton would go out forever. Slowly, one by one, the men stepped forward. They didn't do it for the money. $10 wouldn't buy a soul back from the grave. They did it because they couldn't bear to leave the man on the horse alone in the dark. But the British were no longer sleeping. General Cornwallis, humiliated by the loss at Trenton, had raced south with 8,000 fresh, angry troops. He pinned Washington's exhausted rebels against the Assunpink Creek. The British campfires lit up the horizon like a crown of thorns. Cornwallis looked across the water and smiled, famously remarking that he would bag the fox in the morning. He went to sleep confident that by sunrise the rebellion would be a footnote in the ledger of the British Empire. In the dead of night, Washington played his final card. He ordered a small crew to keep the campfires burning bright and to make as much noise with shovels and picks, mimicking the sound of men digging fortifications. While the British watched the glowing embers, Washington led his entire army, artillery and all, off the main road. They moved in a wide, silent arc around the British flank, treading over frozen mud that had miraculously hardened enough to support the weight of their cannons. As the sun rose on January 3, 1777, the British at Princeton were stunned to see an army of ghosts emerging from the woods behind them. The fighting was primal. At one point, the American lines began to break under a British bayonet charge. Washington, seeing the collapse, spurred his horse directly into the line of fire, riding between the two armies until he was less than 30 yards from the British muzzles. His aides pulled their hats over their eyes, unable to watch their leader be shredded by lead. When the smoke cleared, the British had broken, and Washington was still standing, waving his hat and shouting for the pursuit. The 10 crucial days ended with the British retreating toward New York, their grip on the colonies fractured. But the silence that followed in the winter quarters at Morristown was heavy. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind the reality of what they had committed to. They had survived the winter, but they had traded their humanity for a chance at a country. The men looked at their general, and the general looked at the horizon. They had saved the revolution, but they had learned a terrifying truth. In this war, the only reward for surviving a miracle was the permission to endure another year of agony.
By the winter of 1777, the war had stopped being about grand maneuvers and started being about the slow, silent erasure of the human body. The Continental Army crawled into Valley Forge not as conquerors, but as prey. There was no battle here, no glorious charge. The enemy wasn't the British. They were warm and well-fed 20 miles away in Philadelphia. The enemy was the wind, the hunger, and the invisible rot of disease. Washington's men were ordered to build a city of log huts from nothing, hacking at the frozen timber with dull axes. The ground was so hard it broke shovels. Within weeks, the encampment smelled of death and horse manure. Men sat in huts with no windows, huddled around fires that stung their eyes, listening to the rhythmic, wet coughing of the dying. They were eating fire cake, a flavorless gray paste of flour and water baked on a hot stone. When the flour ran out, they ate nothing. Some men, driven to a feverish madness by hunger, were found chewing on the leather of their own shoes or the frozen remains of horses that had dropped in the traces. The hospital huts were little more than morgues with chimneys. If you went in with a broken foot, you came out in a pine box with smallpox or typhus. The surgeons, their aprons stiff with dried blood, had no medicine, no bandages, and no hope. They watched helplessly as the putrid fever swept through the ranks. Washington walked the lines every day, a silent, grim specter. He wrote to Congress that his army was starving, naked, and forgotten, warning them that unless a miracle arrived, the men would either dissolve or mutiny. But Congress was safe in the interior, debating politics while the army turned into a collection of skeletons. Then, out of the frozen woods, stepped a man who looked like a caricature of a soldier, Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. A Prussian officer who spoke no English, he arrived with a silver-headed cane and a heart full of professional violence. He looked at the shivering, disorganized mob and saw raw material. He didn't offer them food. He offered them a reason to hate him more than they hated the cold.
Steuben turned the camp into a forge. He screamed in German and French, his translators struggling to keep up as he taught the Americans how to move as a single, lethal machine. He taught them that a bayonet wasn't a tool for roasting meat, but a weapon for the kill. He reorganized the camp, moving the latrines away from the water and the kitchens away from the filth. He gave them the one thing hunger had stolen, a sense of lethal purpose. Under his watch, the ragamuffins stopped being farmers with guns and started being a professional cast of killers. When the spring thaw finally came, the mud of Valley Forge held the bodies of nearly 2,000 men who never saw a single redcoat. They had been killed by the neglect of their own government and the cruelty of the earth. But the men who marched out of that valley in June 1778 were different. Their eyes were sunken and their ribs were visible, but they moved with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. The nightmare of the winter had stripped away everything that wasn't essential. They had survived the worst the planet could throw at them, and in doing so, they had become something far more dangerous than the British had ever anticipated. They were no longer fighting for a dream of liberty. They were fighting for each other and for the sheer, bloody spite of having survived. The war was about to turn, not through a stroke of genius, but through the cold, hard edge of men who had seen the bottom of the grave and climbed back out. The transition from the ice of Valley Forge to the sand of New Jersey was a descent from one circle of hell into another. By June 1778, the freezing hunger had been replaced by a heat so thick it felt like breathing hot oil. The British were abandoning Philadelphia, a massive column of red wool and heavy wagons stretching for 12 miles across the countryside. Washington, sensing the kill, pursued. When the two armies finally collided at Monmouth Courthouse, the temperature hit 100 degrees. Men didn't just die from musket balls that day, they died from the sun. Soldiers dropped in their tracks without a wound on them, their hearts bursting inside their wool coats. The air was a cocktail of sulfur and dust. In the middle of this shimmering haze, the American line began to buckle. General Charles Lee, a man of high ego and low courage, ordered a retreat just as the British bayonets began to glint through the smoke. The chaos was infectious. Men began to run, the nightmare of Long Island threatening to repeat itself. Then, out of the dust, Washington appeared. Eyewitnesses said he was riding a massive white horse, his face twisted in a rare, terrifying rage. He intercepted Lee in the middle of the road and unleashed a volley of oaths that supposedly shook the leaves on the trees. He turned the fleeing men around, nothing but the sheer force of his presence. Under the blistering sun, the training from Valley Forge finally snapped into place. The Americans didn't just hold, they counterattacked. They stood toe-to-toe with the finest infantry in the world in a grueling 12-hour slugfest. That night, both armies lay in the tall grass, too exhausted even to moan, their tongues swollen from thirst. When the sun rose, the British were gone, having slipped away under the cover of darkness. Monmouth was a draw on paper, but a transformation in spirit. The country clowns were gone. In their place stood a professional engine of war that had survived the ice and mastered the heat. But the war was drifting. It moved south into the swamps of the Carolinas and the forests of Virginia, where it turned into a gritty, partisan nightmare. This wasn't the gentleman's war of the North. This was neighbor murdering neighbor in the dark. It was a war of burning barns, hanging loyalists from porch beams, and the swamp fox vanishing into the black water after gutting a British supply line. The revolution had become a slow, grinding war of attrition, a test of who could bleed the longest without fainting. By 1781, the British General Cornwallis had retreated to a small tobacco port called Yorktown, believing the sea would be his rescue. He didn't know that the French fleet had finally arrived to slam the door shut. Washington saw the opening and moved with a speed that defied the age. He marched his army 400 miles in the summer heat, pinning Cornwallis against the York River. The end came not with a grand speech, but with the relentless, rhythmic thud of French and American siege guns. For 3 weeks, the earth shook. The British inner works were pulverized into red dust. In the final hours, Alexander Hamilton led a bayonet charge into a British redoubt, the men forbidden from even loading their guns so the click of a trigger wouldn't give them away. They took the fort in the dark, with nothing but cold steel and heavy breathing. When the British finally emerged to surrender on October 19, 1781, their bands played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." It was a fitting choice. A collection of colonies had outlasted an empire. But as the British stacked their muskets in the mud, there was no cheering from the American ranks. There was only a heavy, ringing silence. They looked at each other, scarred, limping, and gray-haired before their time, and realized the world they had broken could never be put back together the same way. The war ended in a fog of debt, broken promises, and the quiet grief of tens of thousands of mothers whose sons were buried in unmarked trenches from Quebec to Savannah. The United States was born, but it was born on a bed of bones. As the last ships disappeared over the horizon, the survivors were left with a continent and a question that still echoes. Was the ghost of the old world truly gone, or had they simply built a new cage for themselves? The war was over, but the peace was lethal. By March 1783, the Continental Army was rotting from within. They were stationed at Newburgh, New York, huddled in a sprawling city of huts, waiting for the money they had been promised years ago. They were heroes on paper, but in reality they were a mob of angry, armed men who had been abandoned by the politicians in Philadelphia. Congress was broke, the states were bickering, and the officers were beginning to realize that once they laid down their swords, they would be nothing more than beggars in the country they had just bled to create. The air in the officers' mess grew thick with the scent of mutiny. Anonymous letters, the Newburgh addresses, began to circulate, written with a sophisticated, venomous elegance. They urged the army to refuse to disband. They suggested that if the government wouldn't pay, the army should simply march on Philadelphia and take what was theirs at the point of a bayonet. It was the birth of a military coup, a moment where the American experiment nearly choked on its own debt. The man looked to Washington, expecting him to lead the charge or get out of the way. On March 15th, Washington walked into a heated assembly of his officers. The room was cold, filled with men who had survived the ice of Valley Forge and the lead of Monmouth, men who now looked at their commander with eyes like flint. They felt betrayed. Washington took the stage, his movements heavy. He began to read a speech, but the words weren't landing. The anger in the room was a physical weight, a wall of resentment he couldn't climb. Then he stopped. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of spectacles, a new, humbling addition that none of his men had ever seen him wear in public. He fumbled with them, his hands shaking slightly. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." The wall collapsed. In that single human moment, the anger turned into a gut-wrenching shame. The officers didn't see a general. They saw a man who had sacrificed his health, his wealth, and his youth alongside them. They saw the cost of the war etched into the lines of his face. The mutiny died in a chorus of muffled sobs. Washington didn't save the Republic with a sword that day. He saved it with a pair of glasses and a confession of weakness. But the scars remained. When the army finally disbanded, there were no parades for the rank and file. Men who had spent 8 years in the shadow of death simply turned around and started walking home. They walked back to farms that had been foreclosed, to wives who were strangers, and to children who didn't recognize their fathers. They carried nothing but their muskets and a piece of paper signed by Washington, a discharge that was supposed to be worth money, but was often traded for a meal or a bottle of rum at a roadside tavern.
The United States was officially a nation, but it was a jagged, fractured thing. The spirit of '76 had been forged in a furnace of fear and blood, and as the veterans settled back into the soil, they realized they had birthed a monster they didn't yet know how to domesticate. They had traded a king for a vacuum, a distant tyranny for a local chaos. The story of the American Revolution is often told as a triumph of light over dark, but for those who lived through the silence of the Newburgh woods, it was something much more haunting. It was the realization that liberty is not a destination, but a relentless, exhausting burden. They had won their freedom, but they had lost their innocence. As the last campfires at Newburgh flickered out, the men left behind a world that was technically at peace, but forever haunted by the memory of the Black River, the red snow, and the terrifying cost of choosing to be free. The homecoming was a ghost story. When George Washington finally rode through the gates of Mount Vernon in the winter of 1783, he was a man returning to a life he no longer fit into. The floorboards creaked under the weight of a legend, but the man inside the uniform was hollow. He had spent 8 years staring into the abyss of human nature, and now he was expected to return to the quiet rhythm of a Virginia planter. But the silence of the Potomac was loud with the memories of the men he had left in the mud. He wandered his fields like a stranger. The Revolution had been won, but his estate was in ruins, his finances were a wreckage of debt, and his mind was a theater of shadows. He was the most famous man on the planet, a secular god to a new nation, yet he spent his nights staring at the candle flame, realizing that the liberty he had won was built on a foundation of human property. The dark irony of his life began to poison his peace. He was the great liberator who went to bed every night served by people in chains. He began to see the faces of the enslaved not just as laborers, but as a silent, judging mirror of the very tyranny he had just overthrown. The country he had birthed was also failing to find its pulse. The states were clawing at each other's throats, the currency was worthless, and the United States felt more like 13 bickering siblings fighting over a carcass. In 1787, the call came for him to emerge one last time, not to lead an army, but to preside over a closed-door meeting in Philadelphia where the rules of the New World would be written. The Constitutional Convention was a room full of brilliant, terrified men trying to trap lightning in a bottle. They created a presidency because they knew Washington would be the first to hold it, and they trusted him not to become the monster they had just decapitated. His presidency was a slow-motion tragedy of duty. He felt like a culprit going to the place of his execution on his inauguration day. He spent 8 years trying to hold together a cabinet that was a snake pit of rivalries, watching as Hamilton and Jefferson tore at the fabric of the government. He was a man who hated factions, forced to watch the birth of political parties that he knew would eventually tear the country apart. By the time he walked away in 1797, he was exhausted, his hearing was failing, and his dentures, made of lead, ivory, and the teeth of the enslaved, were a constant, aching reminder of his own physical decay. He went home to die. In December 1799, after riding through a freezing sleet storm that mirrored the night at the Delaware, the end arrived. It wasn't a heroic death on a battlefield. It was a brutal, claustrophobic struggle in a darkened bedroom. The doctors of the time, in their desperate ignorance, drained 4 pints of blood from his body, essentially finishing what the pneumonia had started. He spent his final hours gasping for air, his throat closing, his eyes fixed on his watch as he counted his own final minutes. "'Tis well," he whispered, and then the light went out. He left behind a will that ordered his enslaved people to be freed after his wife's death, a final, silent admission of the debt he couldn't pay in life.
But the nation he left behind was a beautiful, terrifying experiment that had no guarantee of survival. The American Revolution didn't end with a celebration. It ended with a heavy, unresolved tension. The men who crossed the Black River were gone, and in their place was a country that had learned how to fight, but was still learning how to live. We live in the house they built, but we often forget that the mortar was mixed with the blood of those who didn't want to be there, and the tears of those who knew the dream was incomplete. The fog has never truly lifted. We are all just trying to find our way across the river.
The homecoming was the cruelest theater of the war. For the men who survived the lead and the lice, the return to civilian life wasn't a victory lap. It was a slow-motion collision with a world that had forgotten their names. They walked down the same dirt paths they had trodden as boys, but they were now hollow-eyed men who flinched at the sound of a slamming door. They carried their discharge papers like holy relics, scraps of parchment promising back pay that the government had no intention of honoring. In the eyes of the shopkeepers and the lawyers who had stayed home and gotten rich off war contracts, these veterans were no longer the sons of liberty. They were a nuisance. They were a bill that had come due. The American soldier of 1783 was a man without a country, in the country he had just invented. Many found their farms overgrown with weeds, their livestock long since slaughtered by foraging parties, and their families living in a state of gritty, desperate poverty. Because they had been paid in Continentals, currency that was literally worth less than the paper it was printed on, they couldn't pay their taxes. The irony was a jagged blade. The very men who had fought against taxation without representation were now being dragged into debtors' prisons by the new American courts. They sat in cold cells, staring at the walls, wondering if they had traded a king for a collection of local tyrants with better vocabularies. This resentment boiled over in the woods of Massachusetts in 1786. A veteran named Daniel Shays, a man who had fought at Bunker Hill and been gifted a ceremonial sword by Lafayette, looked at his foreclosed farm and his starving neighbors and decided he hadn't finished fighting. He led a ragtag militia of former Continental soldiers to shut down the courts. They wore their old uniforms, faded and moth-eaten, and stuck hemlock sprigs in their hats. It was a ghost army rising from the grave. They weren't fighting for a new ideology. They were fighting because they had been promised a dignity that was being methodically stripped away by the elite. Shays' rebellion was crushed, but it sent a shiver through the spine of the founding class. It was the moment they realized that an army of men who know how to kill and have nothing to lose is the most dangerous thing on earth. The response was the Constitution, a document designed as much to stabilize the economy and protect property as it was to secure blessings of liberty. The veterans had become the cautionary tale, the excess of democracy that the elites sought to contain. As the decades drifted on, the survivors of the revolution became living fossils. By the 1820s, a few white-haired men would sit on porch swings on the 4th of July, their hands gnarled by old wounds, listening to young politicians give speeches about glory and destiny. The politicians spoke of the war as a clean, divine event, scrubbed of the vomit, the screams, and the smell of gangrene. The veterans knew better. They remembered the way the ice felt in their boots and the way a friend's face looked when it was erased by a cannonball. They knew that the birth of a nation was actually just a long, dark night of survival, where the only real prize was the air in your lungs. In the end, the American Revolution belongs not to the men in the marble halls, but to the ghosts in the tall grass. It belongs to the boys who died of thirst in the holds of British prison ships in New York Harbor, their bodies tossed into the mud of Wallabout Bay like trash. It belongs to the women who ran the farms for a decade and were never given a vote. It belongs to the veterans who died in the poorhouse, clutching a pension application that was still under review. The cinematic glory of the revolution is a mask. Beneath it lies the raw, shivering truth of human fear and the terrifying responsibility of being free. We are the inheritors of their trauma,
living in a house built on a foundation of desperate gambles and broken men, forever rowing through a fog that never truly clears.